shop.
All right, guys, welcome back. We're in for another episode of What's in the Shop. I'm going to do something special today. I kind of want to focus on who are those guys. You know, records you see in the store, but you never know who they are, or you're too afraid to ask. So I'm going to sort you out today. It just so happens this next group and guy that I want to talk about, I have kind of a lot of his stuff in the store, which is a fluke to have this much by one artist in the store. But, well, that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to talk about him. And because he's kind of an unknown guy, but he's worth looking into, him and his band. And so I just thought, well, let's talk a little bit about Bebop Deluxe. Now, undoubtedly, this is one of the most classic album covers of all time. Bebop Deluxe, Axe Victim, came out, 72, I think it was. But let's just have a little bit, let's back up a little bit. Who is Bebop Deluxe? Bebop Deluxe, well, they were a band, right? That came out during the whole glam craze in the early 70s, and they're an English band. So, needless to say, they came out at a time when Ziggy was a big deal, Ziggy Stardust and Mark Bolan. And so the band were kind of coming in the shadows of the whole glam movement, mainly Bowie. They got unfairly compared to Bowie a lot of times, but not really, because on this first album, Axe Victim, you should see the back cover, probably post it here, that you see they have a lot of makeup and whatever. And yes, they did have glam tendencies at the first, but hey, that was what was popular in England at the time. But anyway, the main focus of the band, I should say, is the leader, Willie Nelson, not that Willie Nelson. But no, he goes by Bill Nelson, in other words. And Bill Nelson is kind of a very underrated guitar genius, for lack of a better word. But here's what's the best way to describe Bebop Deluxe? Well, if you look up the Prague archives online, they said that Bebop Deluxe were a mix of glam rock, electronic experimentation in music, and straight out rock and roll. In fact, a lot of critics have said these were one of the forerunners, the pioneers of art rock and progressive rock. But that's the whole weird thing about Bebop Deluxe. They're so hard to fit in any category that, well, they're just hard to fit in. And so people often overlook them because they're not easily categorized. But Bill Nelson, guitar genius. Let's talk a little bit about what I have here in the shop about Bebop Deluxe. This copy actually is an import. I think it's a Dutch copy of the first two albums, which is a really cool thing. It's a gatefold. Well, there you go. There's the inside, the back of the first album, Axe Victim. So this is the first album, Axe Victim, and the second album, Futura. Let me back up a minute there. Iconic album cover. Thing about Bebop is the first three albums, Axe Victim, Futura, and Sunburst Finish, were all named about things regarding guitars. Axe Victim, hello, guitar. Futura, that is actually a brand of guitar. And Sunburst Finish, well, we all know what a Sunburst Finish is on a Les Paul or whatever kind of guitar that is. But back to the Bebops. Let's do a quick run through of some of these albums. It's interesting to note that the Bebops did 4 albums in 2 years. Their whole run was 5 albums in 4 years, but the bulk of their output was all done in 2 years under this whole glam rock to basically almost the start of the disco phase, which is crazy. Anyway, Bebop Deluxe, love this album. You gotta have it. It's just a great copy because it's the first album and the second album together. This has the great track Night Creatures, and it also has one of my, the title track, Axe Victim, is great, and Night Creatures. It's also unique. This album is notable for, it has the longest bebop song ever on it, called Jets at Dawn, which is on side 2, and it's only like 7.5 minutes long, but for not a full-on proggy band, that's a pretty pretty long track for a band that was kind of a glam act, you could say. A few things a critic said about this. Oh, well, there was only one single, and it's funny because Jets at Dawn is the longest song wrote, and the only single release from this was called, it dealt with Jets as well, Jet, Silver, and the Dolls of Venus, which was kind of overlooked because the main riff sounds a lot like Mott the Hoople's All the Young Dudes. But one critic had said, All Music Guide said about this in Axe Victim, it was obvious that Nelson was an unusually lyrical guitar player, or guitar slinger, I should say. And the fact that the tunes often took a backseat to his sometimes jazzy, sometimes metalist excursions. Wow. One weird thing about this, even though it's an iconic album cover, when it was first released in its native Britain, that used to be the only way you could get it in America for like the first year or so. They didn't release this domestically in America. So most people had to buy this album as an import only because it wasn't released there. And it also hindered bebop from really taking off because a lot of people were still in the early 70s kind of still, they kind of had a hangover from that British new, what was that term called? You know, the whole new British movement in the 60s, you know, when the whole Beatles and Stones and Kinks and everybody came out. The British invasion, that's what I'm looking for. They were still kind of a little bit overdone with that. So these earlier glam bands and these early British bands in the, British bands in the 70s all had a little bit of a hard time catching ground in the States. But what about the second record here, Futurama? Again, this is another great record. The single released off this was Made in Heaven, which is a great track. It got up to number 36 in the British charts. The B-side of that is amazing. It's one of my all-time favorite bebop songs called Lights. Great guitar work. Another critical, let's see, enough of what I say, what do the critics say? Well, actually, the New York Times said something very nice about this record. They said Bebop Deluxe is redeemed by the brilliance of the band's playing, and particularly Bill Nelson's guitar playing. This record puts Nelson right up there with the other great masters of the electric guitar. I'm telling you, if you do not know Bebop Deluxe, you need to check it out. If you love guitars, this is a guy you need to be into, Bill Nelson and Bebop Deluxe. On to the third record, Sunburst Finish. Another classic album. Every teenage boy likes this record cover. It's obvious to see why. But aside from that, it's just a cool album cover anyway. One of those famous Gibsons. I believe it was the Gibson that Bill Nelson played. The ES 355 or whatever. I'm not a guitar expert, but there it is on fire and makes some people cringe. What about this one, Sunburst Finish? This came out, this was their third album in 2 years, I believe it was. And the single, the first single was Ships in the Night, another great track, really good track. Oh, it's interesting to note, this album, even though it's the third LP, let me back up a minute. The Bebops were having problems because they didn't want to be considered glam. They were too proggy to be glam, and let's just say they were too experimental to be glam, and they were pushing boundaries in all different directions. That caused a bit of a problem for the band because they were pulling in different directions as well. And so they had a couple different lineup changes. When they got to this, the third album, it really started to gel. And this album put them in the charts in America as well as in their native England. And this really got a lot of attention. Well, obviously, because of the cover, but also for the music as well. And so the thing with this, it's also interesting to note, this album was the first album produced by John Leckie. Who's John Leckie? You may notice his name on Stone Roses records, even Radiohead records. He went on to produce a lot of those Britpop bands. I think he even did the Verve in some Verve singles as well. He did Simple Minds as well. But anyway, this is the first album he ever produced. But started to be a hit, got him in the charts on both sides of the Atlantic. Great record as well. Classic album. A lot of people consider this a classic bebop album. If you're into prog, just great guitar playing or whatever. Around the time this album came out, shortly thereafter, they put out a kind of a best of, if I remember right, about a year or so after, a collection of the bebops, if I'm thinking correctly. But anyway, the famous Village Voice music critic Robert Christgau said, talking about this album and some of the stuff that came out on the Greatest Hits album, that they kind of sound like Roxy Music gone heavy art rock, and it makes a case for their cult reputation. He also talked about Bill Nelson's guitar playing on this album as well, that said it's pretty remarkable. Thick yet ductile, whatever he meant by that. Kind of compared him to Phil Manzanera as well. The fourth Bebop album came out in 75, I think. I don't remember. No, this would be 74 because it's 4 albums in 2 years. This is modern music, and you can definitely tell Bebop is getting into more modern sounds by the time of this. Funnily enough, as Bebop went on, Bill got a lot of attention for his playing, and rightfully so, because he's an amazing guitar player. But he kind of wanted to change that and wanted the group to be accepted for a fully cohesive group. So he kind of put off guitar solos a bit as the band went on. They're still there, don't get me wrong, but he's not as flamboyant. This one definitely has a more modern sound because New Wave was just around the corner when this came out. This broke into the US Top 100, and I think it was the highest charting album they did in England as well. Great songs on here. The single Kiss of Light, and of course the title track, Modern Music. They did one more album after this, and then Bill Nelson broke up the band and said, all right, enough. I got to go out and do my own thing. Then he totally lost his nut and went straight into a lot of electronic experimentation and guitar wizardry with Bill Nelson's Red Noise. I don't have any of that in the shop, but we do have some Bill Nelson solo records. I have this here, Vista Mix, which is early 80s recording, and on this record, around this time in the early 80s, after he dissolved Red Noise and just went solo, he was kind of doing music that was very similar or in the same vein, you could say, as Japan, Gary Newman, other kind of electronic weirdos like that. And this is basically released for America. It's an American-only release called Vista Mix. And it's basically the album he did for overseas called Chimera, with a few extra early singles from the early 80s. And this album, it does have the material on this compilation that he does with Mick Karn and the drummer from Yellow Magic Orchestra. What's his name? Yukihiro Takahashi from Yellow Magic Orchestra. So if you like those bands, you may want to check this out. It has the great single Acceleration on this. Also, another classic Bill Nelson. I put a post about this up a while back. This one came out in 81, 82. The Love That Whirls, The Diary of a Thinking Heart, The Love That Whirls. This was actually my first introduction to Bill Nelson and Bebop Deluxe. I learned about this record long before I knew about Bebop Deluxe. And this record blew my mind, especially the track October Man. What you'll notice on this, it's early 80s. There is some very, very nice guitar work. A lot of EBO work, if you like a lot of sustain and whatever. Really artsy, kind of early 80s electronic guitar work. Fantastic album. And this is actually a fantastic copy. It's got some press insert inside as well, which is a really cool thing. A few years later, in the mid-80s, Bill, he wasn't really getting a lot of attention in the U.S., and he's kind of an esoteric kind of character. And he put out an album called Getting the Holy Ghost Across. The American record companies didn't think that was a good idea, that too many Americans would go for that. So they changed the name, resequenced the album for America, and put out On a Blue Wing. Again, typical of that mid-80s type sound. Really nice. Not as much as on this, but some really nice guitar work on here as well. Great synthesizers and stuff, and just kind of really arty type stuff from Bill Nelson. There are a few other Bill Nelson singles in the shop, but I just wanted to focus real quick and tell you a little bit about those. And so when you go through the bins and you wonder, who is this other Willie Nelson? Bill Nelson. Now you know. If you love guitars, you want to check out Bill Nelson. If you love guitars, if you love art rock, prog rock, glam rock, you want to check out Bebops. Guys, thank you so much. I hope you followed me on that. I just wanted to cover ground on who are these guys, and now you know. Bebop Deluxe, you want to check them out. Bill Nelson, worth checking out. You gotta give these guys a listen. Definitely, anybody who has a serious record collection needs to own some Bebop in their collection for sure. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, get in touch, noisyrecordsmx@hotmail.com, or you can send a message if you're watching this on Instagram through the instant message. And love to hear from you. Thanks for all the tips and everything, and let me know if there's anything you want me to focus on. Thanks, guys. Keep on rocking. Stay tuned. We'll see you soon.